Good evening, everyone. I am Janet Dolan, and on behalf of our Minnesota Peace Initiative Committee, I want to welcome you to our fall program. As you see, we've had a smaller audience tonight than usual, and we kind of expected that because I think many of you here actually took part in the grand opening of the new Norway House just a week ago, and we know that was a huge event that drew a lot of people, and we want to congratulate the whole organization of the Norway House on a fabulous opening. But we think it sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the air for the other Norwegian events surrounding it. So I hope you will see this as an intimate evening with three of the best experts in the world we could find on our topic, which is food insecurity. We also want to welcome all of you online who are joining us. This is our first joint, both in-person and online program, and so we hope it's one of many to come. With COVID, we have become familiar with the term supply chain, and that shutting down economies and closing borders quickly disrupts the global supply chain of food and energy. Just as we were emerging from that challenge, war in Ukraine erupted, and we are again seeing a significant disruption of the global food chains, particularly wheat and barley. A simple statistic: Ukraine and Russia provide 40% of the World Food Programme's wheat supply. This tells us how disruptive this war is for the vast majority of the world that relies on wheat and other grains for their daily sustenance. COVID and the war in Ukraine are not the first time that we have seen severe disruption and food insecurity in the world. The 2011 war in Syria is another example. Both weather and conflict combined to dramatically drive up the cost of food for the average citizen. This caused great political unrest, which led to dire results. We can shake our heads, we can say it's terrible, we can wish it would go away, but that will not solve the problem. Although we here may have adequate food, albeit at a higher price, for much of the world, food insecurity means lack of food and the resources to pay higher food costs. Once we recognize the global consequences, we can move on to the more challenging question, which is, what do we do about it? Or more importantly, is there anything that can be done about it? That will be the topic of this evening's program. War, conflict, sanctions, nationalism, and climate change can easily lead to global food insecurity. This can lead to civil disruption, including mass migration of millions of people seeking food or greater prosperity to pay for the higher cost of living. Or it can result in political unrest and ultimately wars and other conflicts over access to resources and the cost of resources. To better inform us about these issues, and more importantly, to discuss ramifications and some solutions, we have an excellent panel joining us this evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce those speakers. Tom Hanson is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with the Department of State, whose diplomatic postings include East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. Tom currently serves as diplomat in residence at the Alworth Institute for International Affairs at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. He also serves as the chair of the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations and as co-chair of the Minnesota-China Business Council. He's a past board member of the Oslo Center for Peace and Human Rights and director at the Institute of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. As a member of the Great Decisions Advisory Committee of Global Minnesota, Mr. Hanson speaks frequently on international issues and contributes to local and international media. Tom holds a BA degree from the University of Minnesota and graduate degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, the Institute of Advanced International Studies in Geneva, Switzerland, and the National School of Administration in Paris, France. Our second guest this evening is Professor John Mazis. Professor Mazis from Hamline University has already joined us once in 2014 to discuss Russia's annexation of the Ukraine territory. He is here tonight to update us on the war in Ukraine and what may lie ahead. He will also discuss the role of Ukraine in the food supply of the world and how this war is impacting that. Professor Mazis is the Department Chair for Middle East Studies and History at Hamline University. He earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD from the University of Minnesota and has been at Hamline since 1999. In 2006, he was awarded the Agnes Hallberg Conger Prize for outstanding scholarly work in the humanities. He teaches courses on the Russian Empire and the USSR, as well as the history of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So he is well positioned to give us a historical perspective on the dynamics of that part of the world. Our third guest is Dr. Arif Husain. Dr. Husain is joining us via Zoom from Rome. Yes, it is 2 a.m. in Rome. So we very much appreciate Dr. Husain's willingness to join us. He's the Chief Economist and Director of Food Security Analysis and Trends Services for the UN World Food Program in Rome, Italy, which he joined in 2003. Dr. Husain's work focuses on analyzing food security and welfare conditions in developing countries to better inform humanitarian responses. His research interests include application of information technologies to improve the humanitarian responses, understanding the linkages between poverty, hunger, conflict, and migration, and analyzing how global economic shocks impact food security, social protection, and emergency and development issues. While Dr. Husain is based in Rome, he has a Minnesota connection. He has a PhD in agricultural and applied economics with a minor in forestry from the University of Minnesota. He taught at the Hubert Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs, and in 2021, he received the Distinguished Leadership Award for Internationals from the University of Minnesota. I know we will have a very informative and thoughtful discussion from all of our speakers on the issues, the challenges, and hopefully some of the solutions for global food insecurity. Before we turn to our panel, we're going to open with a fan favorite of our program, Tom Hanson, who's going to give us a brief overview of the current crisis, the factors fueling it, and how it's viewed globally. Just to quickly review the format for the program, we will have opening statements from Tom, Professor Mazis, and Dr. Husain. I will then ask each of them a number of questions, and then we will open it to you and take questions from you in our audience, both here in person and online. For those of you who are here in person in the audience, we have provided cards for you. You can write your question and submit it to the end of the row, and someone will be collecting them and bringing them to me so I can ask them of the panel. For those of you who are joining us online, you can ask questions by clicking on your screen on the Q&A. And the location of this function will depend on whatever device you're using, but a window should appear. You can type your question and press Enter to send. Our committee will collect the questions, and we will get to as many as time allows. It does take some time to gather them together, so I urge you, especially if you're online, to put your questions in as early as you can. And finally, again, for any of you who are joining us online, if you choose to leave, you can select End and then Leave Meeting. Thank you for joining us both in person and online for this evening's program. And I want to close by assuring you we will end promptly at 8:30. Now, with that, I turn it over to Tom Hanson for his opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Janet, and thank you to Norway House, the Minnesota Peace Initiative, for organizing this program on what may be the most important topic facing us today. The world has been here before, unfortunately. We recall 1985, when a disastrous famine in Ethiopia led to a popular outpouring, the Food Aid concerts in Britain with Bob Geldorf, to mobilize the global community to give money in this tragic situation. 2010, 2011, once again, a major food crisis that actually led in part to the Arab Spring and to the Syria conflict, as climate-related food disruption led to a destabilization of that country. And here we are again. It's worse today. It's far worse today. And the response, maybe because we're so distracted with so many other issues right now, has been wanting. As Janet mentioned, the COVID crisis and supply chain disruptions were already causing food instability. Even before COVID, there were indications that a food crisis was brewing in the global south. Add to that now then the Ukraine crisis, and it is a crisis of tragic proportions. The UN Charter and Universal Declaration of Human Rights has declared food as a basic human right and as a principal component of the universal right to life. And on that basis, the world community should be mobilizing now, more than it is, to meet these challenges. Because the UN estimates that 828 million people, 828 million, go to bed hungry at this point. Food insecurity in the last 2 years has increased from 135 million people in severe food insecurity to 345. This is far worse than 2010, 2011, and we need to respond as a global community and as a country, the United States, to this challenge. The UN has singled out 19 hunger hotspots around the world today. Of these, 6 are deemed critical. Number 1, Afghanistan. This is a result of our rather discombobulated pullout. I personally, and actually most of the world, finds it questionable that the U.S. has confiscated the central bank assets of Afghanistan parked in the West at this crucial moment for food hunger in Afghanistan. Ethiopia is the second after Afghanistan. Conflict has been raging there, but also drought, as in many countries right now. Third is Nigeria, one of the fastest growing countries in the world. Record high food hunger, once again a conflict zone, and among the 6 most critical. Somalia, there was an excellent article by John Rash, the estimable foreign affairs reporter for the Star Tribune, on the weekend, documenting just how grave the food crisis is right now in Somalia, a combination of drought and, of course, conflict. It's estimated that 45% of the population right now in Afghanistan is challenged by food and hunger. The 5th is South Sudan, which has been a problem for many years. And finally, Yemen, although the Yemen crisis is easing slightly, but it is still very severe. So the UN has declared that a record number of people worldwide are moving toward starvation in the current situation. In the global south, in the developing world, families spend about 20% of their overall resources on food. In Africa, that number is 40%. So, as I say, the emerging markets and the developing world are bearing the brunt of what's going on. Now, Janet alluded to some of the reasons for this. Conflict, obviously, war is key. That's true in Ukraine, Somalia, Ethiopia. But climate is definitely a big problem in this regard. The former executive director of the World Food Program, Josette Shireen, who was, Shirinan rather, who was in that position in 2011, has said, and here she's quoting Alfred Henry Lewis from a 1906 quote, "There are 7 meals only between civilization and anarchy. And in many parts of the world, this destabilizing effect of hunger is raging." People speak of the hunger season in the developing world. If there's one failed rainy season, just one, the hunger season sets in. Well, in much of Africa and in Somalia, there have been 4 in a row. In some parts of the world, 5 failed rainy seasons. And as a result, we see what is happening in those countries. So conflict, climate, but also in the context of Ukraine, sanctions. Sanctions are a blunt instrument that have varying effects. The Russians are claiming that it's the sanctions that are preventing Russian agricultural materials and even Ukrainian from getting out. Now that's obviously a propaganda point. But there are issues with sanctions, and at present, the West is losing the narrative competition on the causes of global famine. In much of the emerging markets in the global South, people are blaming sanctions rather than Russia's invasion of Ukraine as the primary cause of global hunger. This is true of Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa. It's true of the president of the African Union, who has made statements along those lines. We are sending diplomats all around the developing world to try to counter this narrative of sanctions being responsible. We may talk more about sanctions later because they are a major issue in this issue. Now, as Janet pointed out, Russia, Ukraine account for nearly 1/3 of wheat, barley exports in the world, 1/2 of sunflower oil, and Russia and Belarus are number 1 and 2 for potash exports, which are key for fertilizers. So the blockage of exports from Ukraine and from Russia are a big part of the problem today. There was a grain export deal reached in July. Ukraine wants it extended. There are 3 ports operating right now out of Ukraine, supposedly alleviating global hunger with exports. Russia has accused the West and Ukraine of diverting these exports to rich countries and away from the global South. Some adjustments have been made, but this is obviously partly a propaganda line. And secondly, Russia says that the West is not removing what they call the logistics sanctions on Russian exports to open global markets to Russian grains and fertilizer. And as a result, they are threatening not to renew the July agreement on exports, which would be a disaster if that happens. Ukraine, meanwhile, is claiming that Russian interference has left 3 of their ports operating at less than 1/3 capacity, and they speak of a backlog of 150 ships that are waiting to fulfill the existing contracts for exports to the developing world. So politics, global politics, are playing a major role in this disruption. Now, the Vienna Declaration on Human Rights in 1993 declared that food should never be used as a political tool, nor hunger as a weapon. It is considered a war crime under the 1949 Geneva Convention. So are there war crimes going on here by the Russians in their invasion and now the blocking of exports? Or are sanctions, in some cases, a war crime? Anyway, this debate is raging I'm mentioning this because in the emerging markets, this is a discussion. In the global south, the narrative is very unclear. Looking ahead, the UN population report, which just came out in 2022, points to population growth as a potential major factor in global famines going forward. Because more than 1/2 of global population growth up to 2050 will be in just 8 countries. 1/2 of the overall growth of the human population in just 8 countries. And they are all food insecure. Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Nigeria, which may come up toward 800 million by the end of the century, if the statistics are correct, Philippines, and Tanzania. Africa is a focus because, according to the UN, up to 40% of humanity may reside in Africa by 2100, with all that that implies. So it's a crisis. And in concluding, I'm reminded of Norman J. Borlaug, who won the Nobel Prize for his contribution to the Green Revolution. And in his speech in 1970, he said, "It is true that the tide of the battle against hunger has changed for the better. But an ebb tide could soon set in if we become complacent." And I'm afraid that that ebb tide is manifesting itself today, and it's up to all of us, globally and in the United States as well, to address this problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tom, for those very uplifting opening remarks. So, but it's a serious topic for a serious evening, so we appreciate it. Okay, well, Professor Mazis, welcome, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by letting you know that I am a good person, and I even try to be a moral person. And I say that because as a historian, sometimes I know what is good, I know what is moral, but I also know what is pragmatic. And I graduated from the University of Minnesota, and I was taught diplomatic history in the old school of realpolitik, which is not always right, but we should keep it in mind. And I hope as the evening progresses, I have time to piggyback a little bit on what Tom said, because some of those issues are here. It's David versus Goliath, and everybody supports Goliath. I'm sorry, David, but Goliath might have a point also. And Goliath is not necessarily Putin. Goliath is Russia. And Putin might or might not be here tomorrow, but Russia will be. And we might not have to deal with Putin tomorrow, but we will have to deal with Russia tomorrow. So we have to take a long-term view of what is going on. Vladimir Putin had a number of issues as he started his campaign exactly 8 months ago, I believe. Ukraine is not a nation. Ukraine's borders are artificial. Ukraine poses a threat to Russia because of its possibility of becoming a member of NATO, and it shouldn't. And Ukraine has become a hotbed of Nazism. I'll try to bring a little bit history to kind of explain that. The first one, Ukraine is not an ethnic group, is not a nationality. You don't need me to debunk that. The people of Ukraine have debunked that by taking up arms and fighting. So there you have it. Putin was wrong. And one could argue that Ukrainian nationalism is fairly recent phenomenon in mid to late 19th century, but that doesn't make it any less legitimate just because it's a fairly late comer. So there is such thing as Ukrainian nationalism. The question of the borders is much more complicated. And it is much more complicated because what is Ukraine today was or was not historically Ukraine in centuries past. And part of what is Ukraine today, it wasn't Ukraine until as late as 1954. I'm talking about the Crimea Peninsula, for instance, which was traditionally a Russian place, a Russian part, until Nikita Khrushchev felt expensive enough to give it to Ukraine in 1954 to celebrate the 300 years of connection between the two. Of course, that was, I like to tell my students, it's like the President of the United States, if he could give the Upper Peninsula of Michigan to Wisconsin. I mean, the difference is really not there until Wisconsin becomes independent, and then things become much more complicated. So Putin has a point about the artificiality of Ukrainian borders. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have a right to invade another country to impose that. The idea of Ukraine posing a threat by being a member of NATO, that is much more complicated. Does Ukraine have the right to be a member of NATO or any other organization that it wants? In theory, yes. In practice, it's much more complicated. Is it a threat to the Soviet Union in the old days, to Russia today, for Ukraine to be a member of NATO, for NATO to be in the borders of Russia? Of course. The whole point of NATO is to encircle and defang Russia. Did the United States assure Russia that Ukraine and other countries that are now members of NATO will not become members? Yes, we did, not in writing. But we have the notes of important interlocutors in those meetings, both Russians and Americans, and it was clear that such assurances were given, but they were not being put down in writing. We also have the Boris Yeltsin phenomenon. We forgot about him. Everybody has forgotten about him. The Russians are trying to forget about him for the very simple reason that they thought of him, they think of him as an American stooge who really sold the country down the river for his own personal needs. So, and the last reason that I think is important for us to understand, Ukraine as a hotbed of Nazism. No, it's not. On the other hand, there are some disturbing phenomena. In his last speech, when he incorporated those eastern provinces to Russia, very recent, about a month ago, 3 weeks ago, Putin kept referring to Banderists, Banderists, and it was translated into English media as bandits. I don't know if it was a bad translation, which would be horrible, or if it was on purpose, which would be unforgivable. He was referring to a national hero of Ukraine, Stepan Bandera, who was, of course, a war criminal in the process during the Second World War, killing thousands of Jews, Poles, and Russians. So we are talking about the history of the Second World War, which happened really yesterday, right? As far as the memory of the people of Russia and other people in Europe. So it is a much more complex issue than just good, bad. There's also, from the Ukrainian point of view, the bitter memory of being part, not so much part of Russia, but part of the Soviet Union, and I'm talking, of course, about the famine in the 1930s. To this day, there's a debate, was it a genocide or was it a famine? Depends on who you ask. I have my own thoughts about that, but that's not very important. There was a famine, and it was a man-made famine, and 3 to 5 million people died, and I can understand why the good people of Ukraine are not particularly fuzzy when they're thinking of a union or a reunion with Russia, the Soviet Union, or any other kind of similar organization. So I can appreciate their their reluctance, to say the least. And then we have the Europeans. Well, actually, we don't have the Europeans. There's no such thing as Europe. The European Union is following the lead of the United States, in as much as there is a lead from the United States. Tom spent some time telling us where the problems are in Africa and mainly. Right now, there's a major problem in France. The baguette is going up 10 cents, and the people are very unhappy. So I'm not sure if the next shipment will go to Somalia or if we will go to France to make sure that Mr. Macron remains in the good graces of the people. I know in Greece, bread went up by 30 cents, I think, a kilo, which is, we don't feel those things here. We are lucky in many ways. I'm sure prices have gone up a little bit. I hear a lot about sunflower seed oil. I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm Greek, I use olive oil in everything, so for me, the change hasn't happened yet. It will someday, I'm sure. So here we are today. There is a history there. There is a bad guy, and how easy is to point or to pin everything on Putin, and rightly so in many ways. His propaganda is amateuristic at best. Well, not as bad as his military performance, but we are watching a powerful country being humiliated. Maybe it hasn't been humiliated in the ultimate sense of the word, but it is humiliated. And when the war started 8 months ago, my pessimistic thought is, how are we going to manage a Russian victory? And I was worried about that. Well, I'm a historian, I'm still worried. But my worry now is different. How are we going to manage a Russian defeat? Because a Russian defeat can be for us in the long run as problematic as a Russian victory. It can be very problematic if we don't deal with it properly. What is the proper way? I would be lying to you if I said I knew. Do we embrace Russia and reject Putin? That sounds like a good policy, except our Secretary of Defense made the most, he's a smart man, I'm sure, but he made the most stupid statement possible. Our aim is to degrade Russian military capabilities. There you have it. The United States came out officially and they say, our aim is to destroy Russia. He said it. Did he mean it the way I just presented to you? Who knows? Who cares? He said it. That's how it is playing in Russia right now. And Russia has a long tradition of sometimes without basis, sometimes quite rightly so. Russia has a long tradition of phobia towards the West, and this does not help. Finally, the Nobel Peace Prize was given a couple of weeks ago or so, from Norway, of course. I was surprised, or maybe not so surprised, that Alexei Navalny did not receive it. The most famous right now dissident in jail, the most courageous man I can think of. I don't know why he didn't receive it. Is it possible that he didn't receive it because he's on record that parts of Ukraine are rightly parts of Russia? And he is a liberal in the best sense of the word. So our problems and Ukraine's problems are not only with Putin, but are with Russia. And we should take that into account. And I'm looking forward to a little more give and take here. Thank you.
Very intriguing comments. And now, so first of all, thank you, Professor Mazis. And Dr. Husain, you are welcome to join our program. And we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Janet. Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I'm not here or over there in person, but my heart, after several years and all 2 decades, my heart still is in Minnesota. So this is why at 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm sitting here. Let me just start by we are in the habit of listening to numbers one by one, right? So sometimes it's really interesting if you put them all together and try to see where the world is, what is happening overall. And in order to do that, I will just give you a few stats. Tom mentioned a few of them. Chronic hunger, meaning people going to bed hungry without a reason every single night, 828 million. Acute hunger, which we deal with, people who were okay, but then something happened, like war or drought or something, and suddenly they were not okay. This number used to be, before COVID, 135 million. Today it is 345 million. Of this number, there are about 50 million people who we say are one step away from famine. And the scary part, it's not in 1 or 2 or even 6 countries. It is in 45 countries. We've got extreme poverty in the world, which has topped 700 million people. We have wasted children, 45 million. We have stunted children at 149 million. We have people forcibly displaced. With Ukraine now, it has crossed 100 million. And we have about 3.1 billion people who don't eat healthy foods. This is the state of the world in the 21st century. And on the other side, Credit Suisse just came out with their report I was looking at yesterday, which is about global wealth. Global wealth stands at $464 trillion. Even between the last 2 years, it went up by 40 trillion. This is not me, this is Credit Suisse doing this for the whole world. So there is this big disconnect between the haves and the have-nots, and it's becoming more and more vivid. Now, why is all these bad things happening? And if I had to put them in boxes, I would say first and foremost, it's conflict, wars. They create a lot of misery. And I think it's about time that we start to rethink the calculus of war. Days of war in one place and its consequences still in that place are long gone. Ukraine is a classic example. Whatever is happening in Ukraine, it is terrible, but even thousands of miles away, you can feel the pain. That's something which is number one. The second one is economic marginalization. Or in a way, even if it wasn't bad enough before COVID, now it's worse. And people have recovered from COVID, but in many, many parts of the world, people are struggling, and you can see that. And then the third one is climate shocks. Now, this is all what I've said so far. It is kind of like, it didn't start when the war in Ukraine started. It has been there for some time. And I like to say that, this is why, Ukraine war did not happen in a vacuum. It was already a bad state of global food security. And on top of that came the war, and hence, it was essentially putting additional fuel on a raging fire, basically. And just to put that into numbers, before the war in Ukraine, food prices were at a 10-year high. Fuel prices were at a 7-year high. We were already talking about issues of inflation, although calling it transitory, in the US and UK and in many advanced economies. We have depressed incomes because of COVID, but we also have stressed governments. Right now, if you look at just the low-income countries, 60% of those are in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. Food inflation in more than 50 countries, for more than 4 dozen countries, year on year upwards of 15%. Even countries like Turkey, food inflation over 80%. And then you look at devaluation of currencies. And again, in about more than 2 dozen countries, their currencies have devalued against the dollar by as much as 25% year on year. You know, I live in Europe, we have euro. Dollar is now stronger than euro, which hadn't happened in the last 20 years. So that's, again, I mean, you know, this is the impact of what was happening pre-Ukraine war, and then the impact of the war. Now, let's go to, you know, Tom also mentioned this, but how is this different from 2008, the famous food and fuel crisis, when you had riots in 40 plus countries? How is this different from 2011? And this is one question people really ask me, like, you know, what's the big deal on this time? Well, first and foremost, very simply put, there was no COVID in 2008 or 2011. But more importantly to me, in 2008 or even 11, there was no war in Yemen. There was no war, or war had just started in Syria in 2011. There was no war in Ethiopia. There was no war in northeast Nigeria. Even Afghanistan was stable. So maybe at that time it didn't feel like, but world was in a lot more peaceful place in 2008 and 11 than it is today. And on the climate side, if you compare the first 10 years of this century to the next 10 years, climate shocks, both in terms of their severity and their frequency, have doubled. So it's very, very real. And you know, the other thing, now we are talking about, oh, prices are coming down because of the Black Sea Initiative or the harvest coming in. But what people forget is that dollar has strengthened. So these commodities on international markets, whether it's food commodities, whether it's oil, whether it's fertilizer, they're traded in dollars. So now prices have come down, but the dollar has strengthened. So if you're a poor country, you're still in trouble. And I like to say that, you know, we need to worry about when my agency is setting up records. We fed 116 million people, assisted 116 million people in 2020, which was a record in our 60-year history. 2021, 128 million. 2022, this year, we are trying to reach 152 million people. And you know what's strange is that our revenues over the last 5 years have doubled to about 12 billion, but we are still 50% short. This is the story of humanitarian assistance as we are going forward. Now, you want to be more depressed? Let me tell you something. Today, what we are dealing with is an affordability crisis, meaning there is food, but maybe it's not at the right place, or it is definitely not at the right cost. So if you're spending 40, 50, 60% of your income on food, certainly you're in trouble. But if we don't sort out the fertilizer issue, if we don't do it very fast, very quickly, then this affordability crisis come next year turns into an availability crisis. And when that happens, we are in serious trouble. And I think all of us need to do whatever we can to make sure that that does not become a reality. Bottom line, if you're a poor country, if you have heavy debt, if you happen to import your food, your fuel, and your fertilizer, you're in trouble. This is the message which is going out. And in order to deal with that, then we have certain suggestions. And those suggestions, they go in the short term, and also in the medium term. So in the short term, first of all, people are dying, we need to save their lives. We need to keep the commercial trade flowing. Black Sea Initiative is a great deal. I hope it continues. It is already in its third month completed. So there's only one more month. It was initial 120 days. It moved more than 8 million tons of food, all the commercial, and it has gone to the advanced economies which could pay. But we also got about 5-6 shipments out. Trade barriers are going up. That doesn't help. Starving your neighbor is never a good policy. We need to think debt swaps for these poor countries in terms of importing food and their fertilizer. We need to think about new financing facilities, which IMF is doing and others are doing. But in the medium term, we frankly need to rethink war and its consequences and to whom. It's not only about people who are dying, where it is happening, it is about the rest of us also. That's a change. And we need to rethink about our agricultural policies and our energy policies. We need a diversified import base. We need strategic reserves. We need buffer stocks. But you know what? The last thing I want to say is, it's not that we don't know what to do. It's that we need to have the political will, and we need to stay the course, because the solutions which we are talking about, these are things which will not be done in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. But our attention spans are very small, very short. And what happens is that as soon as the shock goes away, we start doing something else. Many of the problems we are dealing with today, they were the same problems in 2008, and they were the same problems in 2011. We did not sort them out then, and we are paying the price for that. Maybe the third time will be a charm, and we will do something about it. I'll stop here. Thank you.
My first question is for Professor Mazis, although I always invite all of our panelists to add their own comments if they want to add on to the answer of the person who's asked the question. Since Ukraine and Russia together are the source of such a significant portion of the wheat for the world, and maybe we could diversify that over the years, but right now it's concentrated. Tom alluded to humanitarian efforts. In other words, let's have basically a truce that allows some of it to get out, and it sounds like it's not going as well as could be. Do you know from your working with the people in both Russia and studying both Russia and Ukraine, is this a viable solution? Are there too many barriers in the way? I mean, is this something that could provide some short-term relief to the rest of the world? And is there enough effort by the West to help try to make that happen?
If I understood you correct, make this truce
work. Yeah, so we could get the ships moving and get everything going to provide some relief.
Right. You know, again, I tend to be a little cynical about those things. For instance, yesterday, as Tom noted, Ukraine said there's 150 ships that can be moved, but they have not been moved. And that's part of the problem. On October 3rd, 3 weeks ago, the Ministry of, I don't know, the Ministry of Agriculture or whatever said that up to now, October 3rd, we have exported as much wheat as we did last year. So at this point, everything was okay. Now it's not exactly okay. I admit it's not okay, clearly, but to what degree that caused more problems that were already there. Also, I agree with Tom, Russian propaganda is big. Their argument in this particular case is the West promise that we can also sell our wheat and get there, not only sell it, but will help us with the banking, because right now you cannot transfer money and so on, and they have not fulfilled their promise. I haven't heard the United States say, no, we have yet. So until the United States says Russia is lying, maybe Russia has a point there. Maybe, I don't know for sure. My cynical part, you should not use food as a weapon, but it helps Russia to put some pressure on the world to somehow solve this problem. It also helps Ukraine to keep the pressure on, do something about it, help us more substantially. So, and again, I don't have inside information either from Putin or Zelensky to be able to say, yes, that's our policy. But it seems to me that both sides have a little bit of an interest to keep up that pressure.
Tom, do you know whether diplomats are trying to open up the barriers or get rid of the barriers, or is it just at a standstill?
I get the impression that it's a bit of at a standstill. You know, the U.S. has taken a kind of a hands-off position on a lot of this. You know, when pushed to state of policy, we often will say, well, it's up to the Ukrainians. In other words, we will follow the lead of the Ukrainians on the overall policy. So, you know, we have accused Russia of putting up roadblocks. We're backing the Ukrainian arguments, but to the extent that communication with Russia has completely broken down, which it has, apart from a recent phone call between our two defense ministers, only the second one since the war broke out, I'm not sure whether we really are weighing in with Russia beyond our public statements.
Okay. Well, in the longer term, Dr. Husain, you're an expert in so many of these areas. It seems that one of the problems that we see is there's a tremendous concentration of food production. You know, when you have 40% of the production of something in one area. Is this unique, or have we all helped make that happen through making everything more efficient by having it consolidated in certain areas of the world? Or is there something else that we can do to try to distribute food more evenly so that when there's a war in one place, it doesn't totally slow down the whole supply chain everywhere?
No, great question. I mean, let me just say that, you know, most countries will produce their own food, right? But they don't produce all of their food. So you are always reliant on importing some quantity of the food which you are going to need from someplace. And when we are in a perfect world, you go to the cheapest place, closest place, earliest place to get that food. And that's how it works. But over time, what has happened is, and it's not about production per se, it is about what we call that our export markets for really important crops like wheat, corn, soybean, rice, they've become really thin, meaning like less than 10 countries export 80-90% of these crops. And worse yet, less than 5 countries hold the reserves, like, you know, 90% of the reserves of these crops, right? So whenever a shock happens to one of these countries, the ramifications of that are felt across the board. And this is what we are seeing now, right? And my analogy essentially is that, look, I mean, if you were you know, investing your own money, you would never go just buy one stock, or you would never go just buy one class of assets. You would diversify, right? But when it comes to our global food security, it's not diversified. We are like, you know, if you look at Middle East, it's like all about Black Sea and single supply chain, right? So when something happened like it has, it doesn't only have an impact on Middle East because they were getting it from the Black Sea region. It affects everybody. Why? Because now you're going to Canada or Australia, which is rising prices for everybody else who were previously reliant on Canada or Australia. So, Janet, the problem again here is that this is not something new. This was the case in 2008 and back in 2011 again. And I think this is what we need to realize, that we are making the same mistakes again and again. And the answer lies in having strategic stocks for countries having their let's say plan A's and plan B's, having those buffer stocks, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't think this is about self-sufficiency either. Not all of us need to produce all of our food because that's not going to be efficient, economically speaking. So countries have to think for themselves what is best, because one glove will not fit all, but at the same time, making sure that you have option A and option B. And right now we don't have option B, and that's the pain.
Okay, so one solution would be, ideally, a solution would be to decentralize the growth of crops into many countries, but perhaps not realistic. But you're suggesting that at least a realistic solution might be to decentralize the reserves and set goals for reserves for the many countries that are suffering, so that, and maybe the West provides the reserves, whatever, but we work out some negotiated way to get reserves built up in these countries. Okay.
Right.
And
that would go some ways, and it is also about bettering or improving the food systems. So it is about getting those technologies. It is about producing more efficient food. It is about producing the right type of food. So, I mean, what is the silver lining? That we saw a problem. Now, if we go solving that problem, maybe we come out better than we were before, right? Mm-hmm. But that will require investments. But for me, I mean, it's investment is one thing. There are $640 billion which can be sitting in agriculture, which could be repurposed for these reasons, including subsidies, another 630. It's like $1.2 trillion sitting there, which can be repurposed. So money is not an issue. Political will is.
Getting the commitment.
And getting the commitment and sticking to the commitment and sticking with it till it's done. That's where we're losing the battle.
And would you say the world would look to the United Nations or to the regional economic alliances? Who would have the political will and capability to try to make some of this happen?
I think, because I think governments must be in the center. Governments need to realize that they need to do this, and if they don't, there are consequences. Then the partners come along and they help as needed. But if you try to solve this from outside, maybe you do it for a year, but it's not going to be sustained, right? So I mean, I look at countries, I mean, this is not I give people examples. I mean, some of today's G7 countries after World War II were completely destroyed countries. They got out. They became the top countries of the world. What did they do? Did we learn anything from them? I think it's the same thing. I mean, it's almost like Marshall Plans, basically. And that's where we need to go. That's what we need to do. And that's where we need to invest. And by the way, before I forget, I think if any country has shown true leadership on the food security side during this crisis, it is the United States of America. They put $5 billion additional through the Ukraine plan, first time, and then an additional $2.9 billion for not Ukraine food security, but global food security. Germany has followed, and I will also tell you who hasn't. Gulf countries have not. Despite the windfalls which have come because of the oil revenues, there are always winners and losers in these things, right? So if energy prices are up, somebody did make money. And that money was made in Gulf countries, especially the G6. And we wish that, if nothing else, the Gulf countries will take care of at least their own regions. And if they can take care of the Yemens and the Syrias and Afghanistans and the Sudans of the world, you got enough resources freed up to take care of the rest of the world. And I think that's an ask which should go out.
Okay. Looks like a big job. Glad to hear that the U.S. has put money in, though. So, Tom, I'm going to ask you a question, and then we'll start taking the questions from the audience. Who's bringing up the questions from the audience? Okay, why don't you bring them up? Okay, I know that your remarks were far beyond sanctions, but I do have a question about sanctions, because They've been used, and I don't think people, or I hope people didn't think of them as a war crime when they did it, but if we don't use sanctions when there is an aggressive move or a bad actor on the stage and a group of nations want to do something to stop it and penalize it and otherwise cause it to change its course and return. If we can't use sanctions or don't use sanctions, is there talk in the diplomatic community about anything else? Or is food the only one and oil would be okay? Or how do we move to a world in which we don't use sanctions but we still have some arsenal of tools?
Right. Well, I mean, sanctions is a important and kind of a complicated topic. So, I mean, through human history, states have used forms of sanctions against each other, most often blockades. I mean, the blockade of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, Civil War was full of blockades that caused hunger. World War I versus Germany. And so in the League of Nations, precisely to avoid another war, the United States and President Wilson insisted that that sanctions become part of the League of Nations mandate, that it be an economic weapon short of war. And in fact, Wilson said it's something more tremendous than war. And so that's when really sanctions got ensconced in diplomatic, and especially U.S. diplomatic practice. There's an excellent book I recommend out by Nicholas Mulder of Yale University called The Economic Weapon, and he traces the history of sanctions. And he claims that in the 20th century, out of 19 times that sanctions were imposed, only 3 times were they successful. And one of those actually was U.S. financial sanctions against Great Britain to get them out of Suez, which was a successful use. Now, the problem is that sanctions are a blunt weapon. They often do lead to starvation in the country, and the idea is that you pressure the government by causing its own citizens to suffer. Now, a turning point came in the early 1990s when it became clear that U.S. and Western sanctions against Iraq had led to the death of about 500,000 Iraqi children. There's a famous interview with Madeleine Albright by Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes, in which Madeleine says, yes, that's true, but it was worth it. And the world community reacted, and so in 1993, the Vienna Declaration on Human Rights said food should never be used as a political tool, nor hunger as a weapon. That's from 1993. And the U.S. changed its laws in 2000 with the U.S. Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act, which said the president shall terminate any unilateral sanctions or unintended or unilateral medical sanctions in effect from the date of this law. And so we stopped agricultural export sanctions against Libya, Sudan, North Korea, and other countries. This is why we target leaders of countries now more than the populations, basically. So sanctions have got a lot of problems, and I'll just say this very briefly. First of all, both sides usually suffer. We see this today. We're putting tech sanctions on China, and I mean big time since October 7th. This is a game changer. Our tech companies are already feeling the negative effects of this. We're going to be taking a big hit on our stock market in trying to hobble China's tech advance. Most importantly, sanctions must be part of a negotiating strategy. For example, Obama's sanctions on Iran were effective because there was a clear negotiating outcome. Iran saw it, and it led to that. But if they become detached from diplomacy and purely punitive, which is often the case recently, then they're not effective. The longer they're in place, the harder they are to remove. The Jackson-Vanik sanctions against Russia from the early 1970s were in place until just very recently. Markets quickly adjust. They find workarounds. We're seeing that with Russia now. And most important, and I think this is relevant today, nations are at their most dangerous when they perceive an existential threat through sanctions with no negotiating strategy. The example always cited is Japan before World War II, where U.S. sanctions were really strangling Japan in its access to resources and oil. And of course, the Japanese way overreacted with Pearl Harbor. And then finally, unfortunately, sanctions often are a gift to autocratic regimes. If there are problems in the country, they can simply say, hey, it's not because of us, it's because of these sanctions. So I personally wish that we would get off of the sanction treadmill that we've been on for the past couple of decades, invest more in our diplomacy, and start opening up negotiation channels, even with countries we don't agree with.
Okay, we have a number of questions here, and so I will try to consolidate them. There are two or three of them that kind of ask the same thing, and so I would ask Professor Mazis and Dr. Husain, as this war has gone, I don't want to say dragged on, as it has gone much longer than people expected, are we digging in, and will this now start to be, as many previous conflicts get to be, a proxy war for interests outside the area, but who have a real stake in the results? And a couple of people have asked, for instance, the oil producers of the world and the fertilizer producers of the world. So are behind the scenes, are they starting to see players outside the area, not concerned about the boundaries, but concerned about the profits of the war, lining up and starting to support both sides, or different sides? So do you want to go first, Professor?
We already saw Saudi Arabia, right? To come out and supporting for now Russia, because it's to their interest for the price of oil to be high and even higher. There is reason to believe that the United States would like that war to drag on a little longer, or maybe a lot longer, because again, it degrades the capabilities of Russia to do something similar again or ever again. You also mentioned other industrial and commercial interests, be it in China or even Europe. You were talking earlier about making allowances for humanitarian aid to move around. Well, when the problem is that the governments of Somalia or Ethiopia, where they need that, they're not negotiating. It is the Europeans, for instance. So the French did allow an exception, and that was uranium for their nuclear industry. So they are looking after their interests, and the interests of the good people who are starving or about to starve are unfortunately of secondary importance to them.
Dr. Husain, you have an agricultural degree, and this is your area of specialty. One of our audience members would like to know, is science and modern science offer us any opportunities to help solve the world food insecurity problem? That is, ways of producing much more, I'm adding on to it, but ways to produce much more grain per acre, or ways to provide much more highly nutritious grain that would, feed more people with less production. Any of those? Are there any things on the horizon that you follow as a scientist to say we may be able to grow our way out of this, or otherwise provide for nutrition?
There is, look, I mean, absolutely, 100%. I mean, the technology, especially on for crops under water stress, has advanced leaps and bounds. I mean, it's from 20 years ago we were studying drip irrigation in Israel. Now, I mean, you have all the satellite imagery, satellites connected to plants to know the stress levels and the water systems to address that. So it's not an issue of not, technologies are there and they would help. But frankly, I mean, I tell people that as is, we produce more food to feed 9 billion people right now. Remember, I mean, we waste about 30% of the food we produce, both on the first before post harvest and then on the plate essentially, right? So it is about consumer behavior also. It is about changing people's habits and making, because that's where, if we are serious about environment, if we're serious about water shortages, if we're serious about land use, food waste is a very big deal. People don't take it seriously, but that is where you can have very quick returns and huge returns on investment. I just wanted to, if you don't mind, I just wanted to come a couple of clarifications on the sanctions questions because it's bothering me. One of them is that, look, I mean, even if there were zero sanctions, okay, which by the way, there are no sanctions on food and fertilizer. Okay, that's a fact. Even if there were, you would still have problems. Why? Because which shipping company would put its ship in a war zone when there were mines there? Which insurance company will insure them? And when they did, what would be the price at which they would do it? So blame the sanctions all you want, but it's the war which is creating all of these problems on the food side and on the fertilizer side. Second, being in Europe, you should look at our energy bills. This is the second thing, diversification, right? So if you look at Germany, for example, 55% of German energy, natural gas, was coming from Russia. NORAD 1, and then they were building NORAD 2 as pipelines. Now NORAD 1 is also shut. There's a huge shortage of gas, which means in our business on the agricultural side, that means that nitrogen fertilizer producing plants, 70% of nitrogen fertilizer producing plants in Europe have shut down. Because one, there is no, ammonia is not coming from Russia through Ukraine. And two, because the price of gas is so high that it's almost prohibitive. Those are the real concerns of this war. So if this war drags on, what I was talking about, this affordability crisis turning into an availability crisis come next year, becomes a reality. So the sooner it is sorted out, the better it will be. Don't forget, I mean, Russia is the largest country in the world. I mean, like it or not. I mean, they have the resources, and that's a really tough deal.
And if I'm allowed to piggyback on Dr. Husain's, yesterday or the day before, because one of the solutions now is liquefied natural gas.
From the US?
Yesterday or the day before, President Macron accused the United States of selling liquefied natural gas 4 times higher in Europe than we have it here. So we are making a profit. Everybody's profiting except those who are not profiting.
That's true. That's absolutely true.
We have time for one final question, and I usually try to end on something upbeat, so that's a clue as to what we're looking for here. But I just wanted to confirm, Dr. Husain, one of the clear takeaways I got from you is, yes, science can do a lot to add to production, but our problem is not having enough food in the world. It's not getting it to the right people, to the people that need it. I mean, if we can produce more, that's great, but we produce plenty now, but that it just doesn't get to the right people. I just want, okay, all right. Okay, so Dr. Husain sort of touched on the Marshall Plan, and 2 of our audience members have asked, could we not, or what would it take, can we, or what would it take to get the world organized like they did after World War I to dramatically provide food? At that time, I believe it was to Russia and that area. But the point is, what would it take, and what are the steps to get us from here to there? to get the world committed to see this as a crisis and move the food to where we need it. Each one of you can have a minute or two.
You put me on the spot because I have to be optimistic. Can you imagine the U.S. Congress agreeing on a major piece of legislation like that?
Absolutely. Trying to be optimistic here.
But
Yeah.
do any of you see any mechanism for trying to actually
It seems to me that
to get the crisis to the point where people say it is that level of crisis that we see once every 100 years and we need to do something?
well, I mean, most Americans get their view of the world through the media, and so I think that our media outlets should be more focused on this than they are. Obviously, we're very distracted with our elections. It seems like it's 24/7. So how do you get these other issues to break through to the public consciousness? I see this as a need more generally to reevaluate the threats that are out there. We're engulfed in geopolitical threat perceptions when in fact the real threats are global and they're shared global threats, including the hunger issue. And how we can sensitize ourselves to that, I think that's the key question. And then people are fear-based, unfortunately. And finally, I think each country can do what it can individually. For our country, I think ethanol is a huge problem. I mean, we produce 40% of the world's corn. A third of it goes into ethanol, which drives up world food prices. I mean, this is a big issue which I think ought to be given more consideration. And in aiding the developing world, I mean, there are issues of distribution and transport, of storage. I mean, there are a lot of things that still need to be done in the developing countries to make the agriculture more efficient. I know the UN has many programs trying to do that, but that'll also be part of the solution, I think.
Dr. Husain, do you have any optimism?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think somebody asked me that. I said, if there is no hope, then why do you get up? There's no reason to get up. So of course there is hope, but the hope has to come with realism as well, no? And I think for me the thing is a very valid question is, what if you don't sort these problems out? What happens? What is the cost-benefit analysis of cost of inaction? And I tell my students and others also, I mean, in a sense that we are trained to ask whenever somebody comes to you with something, even going to the U.S. Congress with something and say, what is the cost? I want to turn that question on its head and say, okay, what is the cost of not doing it? And if you don't like that answer, then you better do it. And if you can live with the cost of not doing it, then don't do it. But and I think that's something which is missing in our calculus in a way. For me, the cost of inaction, whether you look at Syria, Syrian war and refugees coming into Berlin, into Germany, whether you look at Central America, people coming in to United States, or from Haiti into United States, or from Sahel into Europe, the cost of inaction, I mean, when we don't help people where they are, we end up paying 1,000 times more, and I mean it literally. We end up paying 1,000 times more when they enter these countries. And it's not about, migration is bad. This is migration out of destitution. People don't want to leave their homes, but they're forced to leave their homes because of something. So if you can help them where they are, and if you can sort out the root causes, they will not leave their homes. But then we spend tons of money to keep them from coming in or to assimilate them. I think this is where we need to rethink. And we will only do that if we stop thinking like this is somebody else's problem. In a globalized world, what we are learning again and again and again, that it's not now things happen, somebody sneezes over there and you get the cold over here. And I mean, we have to start realizing it's a globalized world where actions and reactions are no longer in the same place. And our policies and our politics needs to adjust to that.
Well, we've had a number of our programs on global warming and on other issues, and the conclusion of almost every speaker, when you get down to it, is if you don't like immigration now, just wait and see what it looks like going forward. So if immigration is a challenge to you now, you better start helping solve some of these problems, or we will have huge climate immigration going forward. So, well, we wanted to use this opportunity tonight to learn more about, first of all, what's going on in Ukraine and how it's having downstream impact on the rest of the world. We also wanted to try to put in perspective how serious the crisis is, and hopefully have you leave with some sense of commitment that all of us have to start doing something to raise the awareness of how bad it is. So I hope that we have accomplished all of those, even though we aren't ready to sign the Marshall Plan for ending food hunger yet, but I think all of your questions and all of our panelists are certainly saying it's on that kind of scale. We need to do something to move the food from where it is to where it's needed, or we will all pay very, very dearly for it going forward. So I hope that summarizes our program. I do want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank the people that helped us with our program. I want to thank our speakers. First of all, we're glad to be back in the McNamara Center. This will probably be our last program here. I'm going to touch on it in a minute in terms of the new Norway House, but we've enjoyed many great programs here. I want to thank Tom Hanson and Professor Mazis, who are here, and Dr. Husain, again, especially for the 7-hour time lag. We really appreciate it. And let's give them all a big round of applause. I also want to thank the board of the Norway House and the executive team, including Christina Carlton, Robin Cole, and Drew Howe. They did a great job in supporting the program and the webinar. And Larry Bakken is here. There's Larry. He is the chairman of our committee, and we thank him for his leadership. And we want to thank our committee members for their work and support of the program. We have a great committee, and it's a lot of fun, so we invite you to join us if you have an interest in global issues. And then I want to get to what I hinted at, which is I encourage you to, first of all, visit the Norway House website. Our programs are all on the website. But I also encourage you to visit the Norway House. We have a new Norway House, and our Norway community had a very successful gala opening of the new Norway House. It was just this past October 15th, and as we said earlier, it included a visit from Her Majesty Queen Sonja of Norway. And this is, the building of the new Norway House is the culmination of a tremendous effort by so many people to build the Norway House so it will better serve the needs of all the Norway House programs, including our own. And as I just said, we've been promising for years that eventually we would have our Minnesota Peace Initiative programs in the new Norway House, and I think that time has come. So hopefully our next program, you can join us there, and there's plenty of parking. So I do want to pass the hat again, though, to say that the last $1 million is still needed to complete the capital campaign. So anyone who hasn't given or has a little extra change and wants to give more, we certainly invite it. And we appreciate your support for the Minnesota Peace Initiative as well as for the Norway House. We work very hard to present global issues, And we also are reaching out now, more so than ever, to other Minnesota organizations that also focus on global issues. And our issue tonight was so timely that, in fact, the UN Association of Minnesota is holding a program tonight on global food insecurity. So it just shows you how your fellow citizens and fellow organizations see this as a very serious issue as well. So we're going to do more cooperating in the future with other organizations, if not co-sponsoring events, certainly jointly advertising and making them aware of the various programs we have and also the speakers we have. And in closing, we want to both acknowledge and pay tribute to the very brave men and women in Ukraine who are fighting so valiantly for their country, their sovereignty, and their way of life. They're an inspiration to all of us, and they continue to be in our thoughts and prayers. For those of us joining online, to exit the program, just tap on Leave the Meeting at the top of your screen. To all of you who have joined us here tonight in person, we thank you. We wish you safe travels, and we hope you will join us for our next program and also all our future programs. For if it is happening in the news, we will be talking about it at the Minnesota Peace Initiative. Thank you very much.